May 1943. The Texas sun hangs heavy over the dusty railhead at Camp Hearn, a blistering, relentless heat that feels worlds away from the freezing mud of the Eastern Front or the jagged ridges of Tunisia. The air is thick with the smell of creosote and dry earth. As the heavy steel doors of the transport cars groan open, a column of men in tattered, salt-crusted tropical uniforms of the Afrika Korps stumbles out into the blinding light. They are gaunt, their eyes hollowed by months of retreat and the final, crushing surrender at Cape Bon. For these men, the journey across the Atlantic was a descent into a fearful unknown. They had been told by their officers and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment that to fall into American hands was to face a fate worse than death, that the Amos were a disorganized, vengeful mob who would likely line them against a wall or ship them to the frozen wastes of the North for slave labor. The transition from the battlefield to this vast, open expanse of the American South is a profound psychological shock. As they are marched toward the perimeter of the camp, they do not see the expected gallows or the disorganized chaos of a collapsing society. Instead, they see a sprawling, meticulously planned city of wood and wire. There are over 600 buildings, laid out with a geometric precision that appeals to the German sense of Ordnung. The guards standing watch are not the snarling executioners of their nightmares, but young men with relaxed postures, their equipment clean and their movements disciplined but unhurried. The German prisoners, conditioned by years of total war and the brutal logic of the winner takes all, look for the hidden catch, the cruelty that must surely be masked by this display of efficiency. Among the men is Unteroffizier Hans Bauer, whose hands still shake from the vibrations of the artillery barrages that broke his unit. He expects the Amos to strip him of his dignity as they strip him of his rank. But as they reach the processing center, the first encounter with American reality occurs. They are not met with blows or spit. Instead, they are led into a shaded barracks where they are handed a simple, heavy object that will become a recurring fixture of their new lives, a thick, white porcelain mug. It is filled to the brim with steaming, fragrant coffee, real coffee, not the bitter ersatz made of roasted chicory or acorns they had been drinking for years. The weight of the mug is substantial, the porcelain smooth and clean, a stark contrast to the jagged, rusted tin cups of the front lines. To a man who has lived in the dirt for 3 years, this single vessel of hot, caffeinated abundance is more terrifyingly impressive than any tank or bomber. It represents a logistical capability that can afford to give luxury to its enemies. The historical weight of this moment cannot be overstated. By the spring of 1943, nearly 150,000 German soldiers had been captured in North Africa. The United States was suddenly responsible for an army of prisoners larger than its own pre-war professional force. This was the beginning of an experiment in ideology as much as logistics. The Americans had decided to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929, not out of naive altruism, but as a deliberate weapon of democracy. They intended to show these men, who had been raised under the shadow of the swastika, exactly what a society governed by law looked like. As Hans takes his first sip of the rich, dark brew, looking out through the barbed wire at the seemingly endless Texas horizon, the first cracks begin to appear in his indoctrinated world. He had expected the end of the world. Instead, he found a cup of coffee and a seat on a clean wooden bench. The psychological landscape of the German soldier in 1943 was a fortress built on 10 years of intensive ideological engineering. For many of the men now settling into the barracks at Camp Hearn, the National Socialist worldview was not merely a political preference, but a fundamental reality of nature. They had been taught that the world was a brutal hierarchy where the strong devoured the weak, and that the United States was a decaying, mongrelized society, a plutocracy, led by shadowy elites who would surely treat their captives with the same cold-blooded efficiency that the Reich applied to its own enemies. In their minds, the lack of immediate violence from their American captors was a ruse, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to lower their guard before the inevitable liquidation. They waited for the mask to slip, searching every interaction for the familiar cruelty they had been conditioned to expect. This expectation was deeply rooted in the experiences of the Eastern Front, where the war had stripped away all pretenses of chivalry. Those who had transferred from the Russian steppes to North Africa brought with them stories of total annihilation, of prisoners executed in forest clearings or marched to death in the snow. To these men, the American soldiers appeared dangerously soft, their uniforms loose-fitting and their demeanor almost casual. The German officers maintained a rigid internal discipline, attempting to preserve the structure of the Wehrmacht even behind barbed wire. They held secret meetings, enforced salutes, and monitored the rank and file for any signs of defeatism. They viewed the American adherence to the Geneva Convention as a sign of weakness, a terminal flaw in the democratic character that the Reich would eventually exploit. However, the reality of the American encampment began to exert a slow, corrosive pressure on these preconceptions. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a series of quiet, undeniable facts. The prisoners were shocked to find that they were being fed the same caloric intake as the American guards, roughly 4,000 calories a day of meat, vegetables, and fruit. They were provided with dental care, libraries, and even the opportunity to take university-level courses. Most confusing of all was the American insistence on treating the individual soldier as a human being with specific rights, regardless of his status as a captured enemy. This was a direct contradiction to the Führerprinzip, where the individual existed only to serve the state. In Texas, the Americans were accidentally demonstrating that their weak system was capable of an organized, industrial-scale humanity that the superior Reich could no longer provide for its own people. The tension between what they had been told and what they were seeing created a profound cognitive dissonance. As the men sat in the shade of their barracks, many clutched those same heavy white porcelain mugs, the heat of the coffee a constant reminder of an abundance that should not exist in a collapsing society. The mug became a silent witness to their internal struggle. If the Americans were as weak and disorganized as Goebbels claimed, how could they ship millions of tons of supplies across U-boat-infested waters just to feed their prisoners? If they were as cruel as the propaganda suggested, why were they wasting porcelain and real sugar on the men who had tried to kill them? The fortress of their ideology was not being toppled by shells or bombs, but by the quiet, methodical application of fairness and the unsettling presence of plenty. The heavy white porcelain mug stood as a silent, immovable sentinel on the long wooden tables of the Kampern mess hall. To the newly arrived German prisoners, it was an object of profound, almost religious significance. In the final desperate months of the North African campaign, the Afrika Korps had survived on ersatz coffee, a bitter, gritty sludge brewed from roasted grain or scorched acorns, served in rusted tin cups that burned the fingers and tasted of metallic decay. Now, in the heart of Texas, they held a vessel that was cooling to the touch but radiated a heat that promised restoration. The porcelain was thick, glazed to a brilliant white, and strikingly heavy. It was not the flimsy, disposable utility of a nation struggling to survive. It was the surplus of a civilization that could afford to provide its enemies with a dignity they had long since forgotten. This mug became the primary lens through which the prisoners viewed the American miracle. Each morning at dawn, as the humid Texas air began to shimmer with the coming heat, the mess halls filled with the clatter of these heavy mugs hitting the tables. The sound was melodic, a rhythmic thumping that replaced the staccato bark of the drill sergeant or the whistle of incoming shells. For a soldier like Hans, the simple act of wrapping his hands around the warm porcelain provided a sense of grounding that no propaganda film could ever achieve. The coffee inside was rich, dark, and sweetened with real sugar, a commodity that had vanished from German tables years ago. It was a liquid testament to the arsenal of democracy. While their own cities were being reduced to rubble and their supply lines were choked by the Allied blockade, the Americans were somehow able to transport vast quantities of high-grade coffee and refined sugar across thousands of miles of ocean, just to serve it to men who had vowed to destroy them. The historical data reveals the sheer scale of this abundance. By 1943, The United States was producing more food and consumer goods than at any point in its history, even while fueling a global war effort on two fronts. The German prisoners were legally entitled to the same rations as American garrison troops, a fact that seemed like a clerical error to the men of the Wehrmacht. They watched as trucks arrived daily, brimming with fresh beef, oranges, and white bread. In their previous lives, a single orange was a luxury reserved for the wounded or the high-ranking. Here, it was a standard breakfast side. This sensory overload began to erode the foundations of their military discipline. The hardline NCOs tried to dismiss the food as a temporary trick, a Potemkin village set up to fool them, but the consistent daily arrival of fresh supplies made such claims increasingly hollow. Beyond the calories, the porcelain mug represented a stability of spirit. The Americans did not seem to be acting out of a desperate need to convert the Germans, but rather out of a deep-seated, casual confidence in their own system. The guards didn't hoard the coffee or use it to bribe the prisoners. They simply distributed it as part of the daily routine. This lack of drama was perhaps the most unsettling aspect for the Germans. They were accustomed to a world where every scrap of food was a political tool or a reward for fanatical loyalty. In the quiet steam rising from their mugs, they began to realize that the American strength did not come from a singular iron-fisted leader, but from an overwhelming, industrial-scale generosity that was as relentless as it was indifferent to their ideology. The white mug was no longer just a kitchen utensil. It was a symbol of a world that was winning the war through the sheer weight of its own contentment. The shadow of the swastika did not vanish at the water's edge. It followed the prisoners into the heart of Texas, creating a fractured society behind the wire. While the Americans provided for their physical needs, an invisible war for the German soul began to rage within the compounds. The prisoner population was far from a monolithic block of defeated men. Instead, it was split between the Nazis, the die-hard believers, often younger paratroopers or SS men who maintained an iron grip on internal discipline, and the anti-Nazis, those who had seen enough of the Reich's brutality to yearn for something else. Because the American guards adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, they initially allowed the German prisoners to self-govern their internal affairs. This policy, intended as a gesture of respect for military hierarchy, inadvertently created a vacuum where ideological fanatics could enforce their own brand of justice through intimidation, kangaroo courts, and midnight beatings. The atmosphere in the barracks grew increasingly claustrophobic as the hardline elements sought to purge any sign of Americanization. A prisoner seen enjoying his coffee too much or speaking too frequently with the guards was labeled a traitor. In some camps, these Holy Ghost courts sentenced fellow Germans to death for the crime of losing faith in the Führer. The Americans, watching from the towers, found themselves in a difficult position. To intervene too aggressively would be to violate the very protocols they held dear. To do nothing was to allow a miniature version of the Gestapo to operate on American soil. This period marked a critical test of the democratic experiment. The Germans expected the Americans to respond with mass crackdowns, collective punishments, or the summary execution of the ringleaders. They waited for the army to show his true violent face and prove that democracy was just a thin veneer over a core of iron. Instead, the Americans watched and waited, gathering intelligence with a methodical patience that confused the German leadership. The symbols of abundance remained. The white porcelain mugs were still filled, the mail still arrived, and the rations were never cut. This lack of retaliatory violence was interpreted by the fanatics as cowardice, but for the silent majority of prisoners, it was the first indication of a different kind of strength. The internal conflict reached a breaking point when a specific act of violence occurred within the camp, a physical assault by a group of Nazi enforcers against a suspected traitor. The camp was suddenly on edge. The prisoners expected the familiar pattern. The entire barracks would be punished, the food would be taken away, and the leaders would be disappeared into the night. They prepared for the cycle of vengeance they had known all their lives. But the American response was something they had never witnessed in the history of military discipline. There was no mass roundup. There was no collective starvation. Instead, the Americans treated the incident not as a military rebellion to be crushed, but as a crime to be adjudicated. The perpetrators were identified and isolated, but they were not taken to a firing squad. They were taken to a holding cell to await a formal legal process. This was the moment the internal war began to shift. The Germans saw that the Americans were not afraid of the ideological fervor within the camp. They were simply indifferent to it, confident that their own legal framework was robust enough to handle any transgression. The white porcelain mug, sitting steadily on the tables during the height of the tension, represented a civilization that refused to be provoked into abandoning its principles. The tension that had been simmering in the dust-choked air of Camp Hearn finally fractured on a humid night in late 1943. Under the cover of darkness, in the shadow of the barracks, a group of fanatical non-commissioned officers carried out a brutal assault on a fellow prisoner, a man suspected of traitorous cooperation with the Americans. It was an act intended to terrify the rank and file, a demonstration that the long arm of the Reich could still reach across the Atlantic to punish those who wavered in their devotion. By morning, the camp was a powder keg. The German leadership, still operating under the brutal logic of the Kriegsgericht, the military courts of their homeland, waited for the American response. They anticipated a display of overwhelming force, the suspension of rations, the mass interrogation of entire barracks, or perhaps the summary execution of the ringleaders as a warning to the rest. In the German military experience, justice was a blunt instrument used to maintain order through fear. For a crime of this magnitude, the offenders would typically be stood against a wall or sent to a penal battalion on the Russian front. The prisoners huddled in their quarters, watching the perimeter fence, expecting the arrival of armored cars or troops with bayonets fixed. They looked at their half-empty white porcelain mugs, wondering if this would be the day the coffee stopped flowing, the day the Amos finally revealed themselves to be the same kind of masters they had left behind in Europe. They braced for a collective punishment that would strip away the comforts of the last few months and return them to the raw, violent reality of war. Instead, the Americans broke every rule of the German soldiers' expectations. There was no mass roundup. There was no withdrawal of privileges. The morning whistle blew at the usual time, and the mess halls remained open. The American camp commandant did not emerge to shout threats or demand a list of names under pain of death. Instead, a small detachment of military police entered the compound with a quiet, almost clerical efficiency. They had already identified the primary suspects through their own intelligence networks. With no fanfare and no visible anger, they escorted the men out of the general population. The most shocking element for the German witnesses was the lack of immediate violence. The guards did not strike the prisoners. They did not degrade them. They treated the event not as a mutiny, but as a violation of a legal code. The announcement that followed sent a ripple of disbelief through the barracks. The accused would not be executed, nor would they be punished without a hearing. They were to be granted a formal trial. To the German mind, a trial for a prisoner of war who had committed a crime against another prisoner was an absurdity, a waste of time and resources. They assumed it would be a show trial, a piece of propaganda designed to humiliate the Reich before a quick hanging. Yet, as the date for the proceedings was set, the Americans began the unprecedented process of assigning defense counsel and preparing a formal evidence docket. This was the trigger for a new kind of astonishment. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug sat on the table between the investigators and the witnesses, a silent testament to a system that refused to abandon its procedural integrity even when dealing with the most fanatical of enemies. The Americans were about to put their own ideology on display, not through a speech, but through the slow, meticulous grinding of the wheels of justice. The makeshift courtroom within the confines of Camp Hearn was a far cry from the grand Gothic halls of justice in Berlin, yet it possessed a weight that felt more permanent, more unyielding than any monument of the Third Reich. There were no banners, no screaming orators, and no predetermined outcome. Inside the room, the air was still, broken only by the steady hum of a ceiling fan and the occasional scrape of a chair. The German defendants, the men who had enforced their ideology with fists and boots only days prior, sat before a panel of American officers. To their left sat their defense counsel, not an American prosecutor in disguise, but a qualified officer assigned specifically to protect their legal interests. This was the mechanics of a civilization that viewed the law not as a weapon of the state, but as a shield for the individual. To the German observers, the procedural fairness was a bewildering spectacle. In the military courts of the Wehrmacht, a soldier accused of a political crime or an act of insubordination was often given a perfunctory hearing before being sentenced to death or a penal battalion. The idea of due process for a prisoner of war was a foreign concept, a perceived inefficiency that the Nazi doctrine had long ago discarded as a weakness of the decadent West. Yet, here in the Texas heat, the Americans were meticulously following every article of the Geneva Convention and the United States Manual for Courts-Martial. They were calling witnesses, presenting physical evidence, and allowing for cross-examination. Each movement of the trial was a deliberate, slow-motion rejection of the might makes right philosophy that had dominated the prisoners' lives. A pivotal moment occurred when the American prosecutor placed a familiar object on the evidence table, a heavy white porcelain mug, stained with coffee and cracked during the struggle. This recurring symbol of American abundance was now a piece of forensic evidence. The Americans did not treat it as a trivial piece of kitchenware. They treated it as a silent witness to a crime against a fellow human being. The prosecution's focus was not on the political ideology of the defendants, but on the specific violation of the law. They were demonstrating that even in a prisoner-of-war camp, even among enemies, there was an objective standard of conduct that could not be breached. The law was presented as something that existed above the whims of generals or the fury of a mob. As the proceedings unfolded, the shock among the German rank and file grew into a profound curiosity. They watched as their own comrades were allowed to speak in their own defense, to challenge the testimony of their accusers without fear of immediate retribution. This was the machinery of democracy in its most granular, least glamorous form. It was boring, it was slow, and it was utterly fair. For many of the younger soldiers, who had never known a world without the arbitrary violence of the Gestapo, this was their first encounter with a power that did not need to shout to be heard. The Americans were not trying to prove they were more brutal than the Nazis. They were proving they were more consistent. The trial was becoming a masterclass in the very freedoms the prisoners had been sent to destroy, and the heavy porcelain mug on the table served as a reminder that this justice was backed by the same industrial might that kept the coffee hot and the barracks clean. The air in the courtroom remained heavy with the scent of floor wax and the faint metallic tang of the oscillating fans. For the German witnesses called to testify, the experience was a jarring collision of two irreconcilable worlds. They stood before the American tribunal, men who had been conditioned to view truth as a flexible tool of the state, only to find themselves in an environment where the smallest detail was subjected to rigorous, dispassionate scrutiny. There were no grand ideological statements permitted from the stand. The American officers demanded only facts, times, locations, and specific actions. This clinical approach to a violent crime was perhaps the most alien aspect of the entire proceeding. To the Germans, the Americans were not just judging a crime. They were demonstrating a different way of existing in the world, one where the individual's word carried weight regardless of their political standing or military rank. As the testimony progressed, the emotional weight of the trial began to manifest in the faces of the German observers. They watched as a young private, a man who would have been a mere footnote in a Wehrmacht court, was questioned with the same meticulous care as a high-ranking officer. The Americans were looking for the truth, not a scapegoat. The defense counsel, an American captain, worked with a tireless, professional intensity that baffled the defendants. He challenged the prosecution's evidence, cross-examined witnesses with sharp precision, and argued for the rights of his German clients as if they were his own countrymen. This was not a performance for the cameras or a hollow ritual. It was a sincere exercise in legal integrity. The prisoners began to see that the Americans' greatest strength was not their tanks or their planes, but their unwavering commitment to a set of rules that applied to everyone, even the enemy. One by one, the German witnesses stepped down from the stand, visibly shaken by the fairness of the encounter. They returned to the barracks and shared what they had seen with the others, their voices hushed and filled with a new kind of wonder. They spoke of the patience of the American judges and the way the evidence was handled with such respect for the truth. In their hands, they still held those heavy white porcelain mugs, the recurring symbol of American abundance that had accompanied them through every stage of their captivity. The mug was no longer just a vessel for coffee. It was a tangible anchor to a reality that refused to be cruel. The steam rising from the porcelain seemed to carry the weight of their shifting perspectives, a silent admission that the decadent Americans possessed a moral clarity that their own leaders had discarded long ago. The impact of this historical evidence was profound. The trial records showed that the Americans were not interested in a quick conviction to appease the camp's population. They were building a record of justice that would stand the test of time. This was a deliberate act of re-education through example. By treating the perpetrators with fairness, the Americans were dismantling the Nazi narrative of a vengeful, chaotic enemy. The prisoners were witnessing the power of a society that could afford to be just even in the midst of a global war. As the day's proceedings ended and the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut, the silence that followed was filled with the realization that the world they had fought for was built on sand, while the world that had captured them was anchored in the unbreakable bedrock of the law. The psychological impact of the tribunal rippled through the barracks of Camp Hearn like a slow-moving tide, eroding the jagged cliffs of decade-old indoctrination. For the thousands of men who were not on trial but watched from the periphery, the realization was visceral. They had been raised in a culture where the state was an all-consuming god and the law was merely its iron fist. In that world, an accused man was a dead man, and an enemy was a subhuman to be crushed. Yet, here in the heart of the American South, they were witnessing the impossible, a superpower that possessed the atomic potential to end the world, yet paused its vast momentum to ensure that a few captured mid-ranking thugs received a fair hearing. This was not the weakness they had been promised by the propaganda ministers in Berlin. It was a terrifyingly robust form of confidence. It was the realization that democracy did not need to be hysterical or cruel to be powerful. The transformation was visible in the small, daily rhythms of camp life. The hardline factions, once so vocal and intimidating, found their influence waning. The rank-and-file soldiers began to look at their American guards not as soft or disorganized, but as representatives of a system that was fundamentally more stable than their own. The cognitive dissonance that had plagued them since their arrival began to resolve into a new, albeit painful, clarity. They saw that the American abundance, the endless supply of meat, the fresh fruit, and the clean uniforms, was not a bribe, but a byproduct of a society that valued the individual. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug, always present and always filled, became a totem of this newfound understanding. It represented a world where a man could count on the consistency of his breakfast and the consistency of his rights. Documented accounts from this period highlight a shift in the prisoners' internal discourse. They began to debate the merits of the American legal system with a fervor that would have been suicidal under the Reich. They questioned the very foundations of the master race theory when confronted with the evident superiority of a mongrel nation's logistical and moral framework. This was the true defeat of the National Socialist ideology, not on a battlefield of fire and steel, but in a courtroom of wood and light. The Americans were winning the war of ideas by simply refusing to play by the enemy's brutal rules. The prisoners were experiencing a psychological disarmament. The mental armor they had worn for years was being stripped away by the relentless application of fairness. By late 1943, The atmosphere in Camp Hearn had fundamentally altered. The trial had acted as a surgical strike against the Nazi spirit within the wire. It proved that the American army was not a butcher, but a builder of systems that survived through integrity rather than terror. As the prisoners returned to their barracks each night, many would sit in silence, staring into the dark depths of their coffee mugs. The warmth of the porcelain against their palms was a constant, tactile reminder that they were no longer just cogs in a war machine, but individuals within a legal jurisdiction. The shock was fading, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect for a freedom they had never truly understood until they became its captives. The seeds of a post-war Germany were being sown in the dusty soil of Texas, nurtured by the strange, astonishing spectacle of a fair trial. The verdict of the Camp Hearn tribunal fell not like a hammer, but like the steady ticking of a clock, marking the end of an era of arbitrary violence for the men involved. The defendants were found guilty of their specific physical crimes, yet the sentences handed down were measured and strictly governed by the legal statutes provided to them at the start of the trial. There were no public hangings to satisfy a vengeful crowd, no erratic displays of power to terrorize the remaining prisoners. The men were simply removed to federal penitentiaries to serve their time. This resolution was the final, devastating blow to the Nazi mythos within the camp. The Amos had not only provided the coffee and the bread, they had provided a version of the truth that was verifiable, consistent, and remarkably indifferent to the rank or fanaticism of the accused. In the weeks following the trial, a quiet program of re-education began to take root, though it was less a formal curriculum and more a natural consequence of the environment. The prisoners were encouraged to read American newspapers, to listen to diverse radio broadcasts, and to engage in town hall-style meetings within their compounds. The Americans understood that a man who has seen a fair trial can never truly go back to believing in a secret police state. The historical transformation was documented in the letters the men were allowed to send home to Germany, letters that spoke of a strange and terrifying fairness that existed in the American West. They described a country that was so sure of its own liberty that it did not fear the presence of its enemies' ideas. They wrote of the abundance that seemed to flow from this freedom, a connection between the rights of man and the quality of his life that they were only beginning to grasp. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug remained at the center of this transition. It sat on the desks of the makeshift classrooms where German NCOs learned about the U.S. Constitution. It rested on the laps of soldiers watching films about the American landscape. The heavy, polished surface of the porcelain had become a tactile anchor for their new reality. Every time a prisoner raised that mug to his lips, he was consuming more than just coffee. He was partaking in the surplus of a successful democracy. The weight of the vessel in his hand was a constant reminder that he was being sustained by the very system he had been told was on the verge of collapse. The coffee was hot, the sugar was real, and the law was absolute. This period of post-trial reflection served as a crucible for the future. Thousands of these men would eventually return to a Germany that was little more than a graveyard of brick and ash, but they would carry with them a blueprint for something better. They had seen that a nation could be an industrial titan without being a tyranny, and that a soldier could be a prisoner without losing his humanity. The astonishment that had defined their first days in Texas had matured into a somber, determined respect. They were no longer the arrogant conquerors of 1940, nor the hollowed-out captives of 1943. They were men who had been broken by war and rebuilt by the steady, unyielding application of justice and the quiet, persistent presence of plenty. As the war in Europe ground toward its inevitable, shattered conclusion in 1945, the thousands of men who had passed through the Texas experiment began their long journey home. They were no longer the soldiers who had stepped off the cattle cars in May 1943, clutching their fear like a weapon. They left behind the dusty plains of Hearn, the humid afternoons, and the sprawling barracks, but they carried with them something far more durable than the uniforms on their backs. They carried the memory of a society that had refused to blink in the face of their ideology. The trial they had witnessed remained the central pillar of this memory, a moment where the sheer, boring, meticulous application of justice had achieved what no amount of bombardment could. It was the realization that the rule of law was not a weakness to be exploited, but the ultimate expression of a civilization's strength. The legacy of these astonished men became a quiet cornerstone of the post-war world. When they returned to a Germany divided and decimated, many of these former prisoners became the civic leaders, the teachers, and the jurists who helped rebuild a shattered nation. They understood, in a way their fathers never had, that democracy was not merely a political system, but a commitment to a standard of human dignity that persisted even in the darkest hours of conflict. They had seen it in the eyes of the American Defense Council who argued for their rights. They had heard it in the dispassionate voice of the military judge. Most of all, they remembered it in the simple, overwhelming abundance of the American camp, the sense that a free people could afford to be both powerful and just. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug remained the most potent image in their collective memory. In the lean, hungry years of the late 1940s, as they stood in breadlines amidst the ruins of Berlin or Munich, the thought of that heavy, steaming vessel of coffee represented more than just food. It represented the arsenal of democracy in its most intimate form. It was a reminder that the world they had surrendered to was a world worth joining. The porcelain was thick, the coffee was real, and the sugar was sweet, a triad of abundance that served as a constant, tactile counter-argument to the bitter scarcity of the Reich. The mug was a promise kept, a symbol of a life where the law was as steady and nourishing as the daily bread. In the final reflection of history, the story of the German prisoners at Camp Hearn is not merely a footnote of military logistics, but a profound testament to the power of ideology. The Americans had set out to win a war of steel and fire, but in the process, they won a war of the spirit. They proved that the most effective way to defeat a totalitarian system is not to imitate its cruelty, but to confront it with the relentless, quiet consistency of freedom. As the last of the prisoners sailed eastward across the Atlantic, looking back at the receding American coastline, they were men who had been conquered twice, once by the sword and once by the scales of justice. They left as witnesses to a truth that would define the coming century, that true abundance is found not in the conquest of others, but in the preservation of the law, and that the greatest weapon a democracy possesses is its refusal to become its enemy.